Good morning, everyone. Set up my many devices. One second. This never works. I'm hoping that's gonna work soon. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Yeah, good morning, everyone. It's an absolute privilege to be able to stand here in front of you, and I'm so thrilled to be able to bring the Word of God to you this morning. I don't actually know if my parents know this, but when I was a little girl, I used to gather all my soft toys, arrange them as my own congregation, and pretend preach to them. So this is a real full circle moment for me. And it's a real upgrade to have actual real-life people sitting in front of me at my mercy to listen. So thank you. And this morning, as you can see, I want to invite you to delve with me into the life and story of Moses, specifically a story that you've probably heard growing up and you're already familiar with. Maybe in Sunday school you went through it. It's a story of Moses and the burning bush from Exodus 3, verses 1 to 15. And so let's turn to it, and I'll read it out loud. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. And Moses saw that the bush was on fire. It did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. And when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivitites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Amen. Now there's a lot here. I've just read quite a big passage. There's a lot to unpack. It's a powerful demonstration of God, and this morning I want to focus specifically on this identity crisis that Moses has here. I wonder if you saw that, and God's response to that. But before all of that, if I were to ask you, who are you? Or that classic interview question that you sometimes get asked, tell me a little bit about yourself. How would you answer? What is it that you would say? Take a moment to think about that. And in fact, actually, I would love to have a bit of audience participation. So if you could turn to the person next to you, because we all love that. Ideally not someone you know or you've come with. And just tell them a little bit about yourself, just for 30 seconds. Okay? You ready for that? I've even got a timer to do this, so we keep on time. All right, go. Okay. You can come back to me now. So how did that go? How did you describe yourself? What is it that you said to describe yourself? Well, you might have answered with where you're from, or perhaps the relationships that you have in life, maybe like the person you're married to, or if you're a mum or a dad or a grandparent, or perhaps what you do for a living. Maybe you're retired, or you're a student, or I don't know what you do, but that's how maybe you could have described yourself. Or perhaps some hobbies you have. Or as Christians here today, and as we're in church, it would be completely appropriate for you to describe yourselves as Christians, as followers of Christ. Well, there are 1,000,001 ways to identify ourselves, to describe ourselves. And since you've done the task of describing yourself, it's only fair that I do the same and introduce myself a little bit. So a little bit about me. I was born in India, in case you couldn't tell, and I've moved around a little bit, finally settling in sunny Southampton when I was 9. I am a wife, a mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a dog owner, and more. I work as a policy specialist in maritime. That's what I do for a living, and I really enjoy it. I also enjoy crocheting and making and eating delicious food, and that is an understatement. And I am a Christian, following Jesus and making that commitment when I was 8. That's a little bit about me. And as I mentioned, I grew up in both India and England. And because I was born in India, I consider myself to be Indian. But I have also spent most of my life growing up here. So I also consider myself to be British. And when I was younger, there were times when it felt like I was torn between the two, and also didn't quite fit into either one fully. Perhaps there might be some of you who understand what I'm talking about. Now, it might not be the tangle between nationalities like me, but it could be something else. Like the person, perhaps, that you are at work versus who you are in your personal life. They could be polar opposites. Or perhaps an illness has entered your life and it's completely turned it upside down. Or who you were before knowing Jesus and who you are now. Perhaps there are things in your past that time and time again creep into your now, things that you would rather just stay in the past. There are many different things that can cause you to question who you are. And today we're looking to the life of someone who wondered that very question that at some point we all ask. Who am I? And this person was Moses. Now Moses had a massive identity crisis. This man who God used to do amazing exploits and deliver his own people from slavery questioned who he was as well as God himself. Now, this is a spectacular moment in Moses' life. It's a turning point that changes the trajectory of his life completely, and it's the start of God's plan to save the Israelites and lead them to the promised land that God had prepared for them. This story of salvation, redemption, and exodus from oppression, it points us to something greater. It points us towards the cross and God's ultimate plan of salvation, redemption, and exodus from sin and death through Jesus for all of humanity. And it foreshadows Christ himself. It points us to the new creation, and it calls us to radical discipleship. But let's back up a little bit to the beginning of Moses' story. And I want to do that because it sheds light to what brought Moses to this point in his life, and it explains why he was questioning his identity. So, this is a story you may be familiar with, but it's good to remind ourselves time and time again. So Moses was born a Hebrew slave. His life would have been destined to toil from sunrise to sunset, 7 days a week, all year long. Everything would be dictated by the whim of his Egyptian overlords. However, the Bible tells us that Moses, instead, he grew up as an adopted son of an Egyptian princess. He grew up having everything that he could ever want. His future, it seemed bright. But we all know that that came crashing down when, out of anger, he killed an Egyptian overlord who was in turn beating and killing a Hebrew slave, the very people group that he was born into. And this led him to run for his life out of Egypt. So for 40 years now, we see that Moses has lived as an obscure shepherd in the desolate desert of Midian. And at this point, his life was so humble that he didn't even have a flock of sheep to call his own. The sheep belonged to his father-in-law. So from what heights he has fallen. So who was Moses? Was he a deliverer? Well, that's what he tried to be when he tried to rescue a Hebrew slave. Or was Moses a murderer because he took the life of an Egyptian overlord? Or was he what he called himself after the birth of his son, Gershom, merely a stranger walking along the earth? There's no doubt that 40 years in the desert had taken their toll. The Moses we find here in this story is a man who was very much like the area that surrounded the mountain, dry and desolate. He might have felt that this is exactly where he belonged. He had wasted his opportunities, and now he would live out the remainder of his days in a place that mirrored him, a wasteland. There may have been times in our own lives that we might relate with this Moses. Times that we feel like we are in a wasteland, in a wilderness. And times that we question, who in the world are we? We find ourselves doubting and wondering if anything good is ever going to happen again. And perhaps we can feel like maybe God has forgotten us. But God makes it very, very clear that he cares. What are God's first words to Moses? Moses, Moses. He calls him by name. So even though Moses was now an obscure, forgotten shepherd in the desert, God knew who he was, and Moses was important to him. And in the same way, God knows you by name. He calls you personally. He sees you, and you are important to him. When we look at Moses, we can be assured that he was a man in deep conflict. He was born into one culture, he was raised in another, and now he's living in a third culture. Is it any wonder then that Moses asked God the question that he does in verse 11? Who am I? Now I want to draw your attention to this part of the passage because it reveals so much about Moses and God's own identity, and actually, in turn, our own. When Moses' identity crisis reaches its pinnacle in this part of his life, he asks, "Who am I?" And notice what God says in response. How does he answer Moses? Well, he doesn't really, does he? He doesn't directly answer Moses about who Moses is, or this crisis of self that he was having, or why he was specifically chosen for this job. But what does he say? "I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you." Now, God's reply is intended to take Moses' focus off himself and onto where it should be, on God. So God never really answers the question, who am I? Instead, he reminds Moses that I will certainly be with you. Who am I? Now, this wasn't quite the right question to ask here. Who is God was the real question. It was the important question. God flips it on its head. I wonder if you can see that. Because it was far more important for Moses to know who God is. Because when we know the God who is with us, we can step forth confidently to do his will and to conquer whatever may come our way. When we know who God is, we can anchor ourselves, our identity, in him. So, who is God? Who is this that we are relying on and placing our identity in? Well, God reveals a lot about who he is in the following verses. So let's unpack that a bit more. So back to the scene in Exodus 3, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush wasn't consumed. So it turns out that it's actually not too uncommon for a plant like this to spontaneously ignite out in that desert. And for Moses, who having spent 40 years in that desert, would be used to sights like this. But there were two things that set this one apart from the usual run-of-the-mill burning bush. Firstly, though the bush burned, it was not consumed. No leaf curled and no branch was charred. And secondly, an angel of the Lord appeared from within the bush, and having gotten Moses' attention through this, God speaks to him. Why? Well, we can see throughout the Bible that fire is often used as a picture of the purifying and refining quality of God's holiness. And when God commands Moses to remove his sandals, for this place where you are standing is holy ground, he emphasizes that gap that is between divine and human. Now, God is transcendent in his holiness, and Moses couldn't come close to him. So, God is holy. Now, holiness involves separation. Can you see that here? God's holiness means that he is set apart from everything that he has made. It is the distinction between the creator and the creature, the infinite distance between God's deity and our humanity. God says in Hosea, I am God and not man, the Holy One among you. And in 1 Samuel, it says, there is no one holy like the Lord. And like Moses, when we understand just how holy and magnificent he is, we should be terrified. Rightly so. But because of Jesus and what he did on the cross and through his resurrection, he bridged that impossible gap that was between man and God. Through Jesus, we are now made holy, so that when God looks at us, he sees the perfect holiness of Jesus Christ himself. Through Jesus, we can now enter into his presence and not have to hide our face like Moses did. Instead, we can boldly approach him and even enjoy his presence. Now that's amazing. What else does God reveal about himself here? Well, that he is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. But God revealed himself to Moses by declaring his relationship to the patriarchs that came before him. And this reminded Moses that he is a God of covenant, and his covenant with Israel was still valid and still important. This wasn't a new God meeting Moses, or an Egyptian God that Moses might have grown up with, or a Midianite God that he would have seen in the culture he was living in. But the very same God that spoke to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob, the God, and was now speaking to Moses. God was reminding Moses that he is a God of relationships, and that he is a God who keeps his promises. And maybe that's something that you need to be reminded of this morning. Later on, God says, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. Here God reveals that he is a God who hears the cries of his people. And not only that he answers and delivers to. Perhaps there are some of you here today who have been crying out to God to deliver you from your circumstance, whatever that might be. Like the Israelites, you might feel like you've been waiting and waiting a very long time, and you might be wondering if God has forgotten you. Now, I may not know what it is you're going through, but God does. He says, I know your sorrows. The God who heard the cries of the enslaved Israelites and delivered them is the same God today who hears you and will deliver you. Now, God's plan may not be what you thought it might be. It could be different. Or maybe you think it's too late for deliverance now. But God's delay does not mean his denial. Let me say that again, because it is important. God's delay does not mean his denial. His timing is always perfect, even though we may not understand why. In Isaiah, it says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." And we can see that in the story of Israel's deliverance, can't we? God had a plan that was far bigger than what Moses or the Israelites could imagine. They'd been waiting for 400 years to be delivered. And we can still see the impact of their deliverance even today. The final thing that God reveals about himself is this, that he is a God with a name. It says, "Then Moses said to God, 'Indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?' And God said to Moses, 'I am who I am.' And he said, 'Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you.'" Now this reveals something very significant about the nature of God, that he has no equal. God told Moses his name was I am, because God simply is. There was never a time when he did not exist, and there never will be a time when he will cease to exist. Life is in himself. We are ever changing. We will always change. Our roles in life changes, our jobs change, our nationalities might even change. But God doesn't change. He is eternal and he is unchanging. And because of this, we can fully trust in him. Because of his steadfastness, we can rely on him. And this is why God turns Moses' question of, "Who am I?" into, "This is who I am, trust me." This is the God in whom we can anchor our identity in wholeheartedly. Tim Keller is a preacher that I greatly admire, and he says this about God and his love, and I think it's quite poignant. "The only love that won't disappoint you is the one that can't change, that can't be lost, that is not based on the ups and downs of life or of how well you live. It is something that not even death can take away from you. God's love is the only thing like that, and that's why we can trust him." And in a way, the name I am, it invites us to fill in the blank almost. When we are in darkness, Jesus says, "I am the light." When we are hungry, he says, "I am the bread of life." When we are defenseless, he says, "I am the good shepherd." God is the becoming one, becoming what it is that we need. What is it that you need today? Whatever it is, you will find it in God, in the great I am. In this, God's name is both an announcement and an invitation. It announces God's presence, and it invites anyone who is interested to find out more and to know him. I am is with you. The gospel is this, that through faith in Jesus' death and resurrection, there is a redefining of who we are. When we follow Jesus, our identity changes. We become anchored in Jesus. And as we understand who God is and what he has done, we can understand who we are and what we are to do. So where do you find yourself this morning? Do you find yourself alongside Moses, feeling maybe down or desolate? Do you feel like life has just beaten you up and you have nothing left to give? And maybe you're questioning everything about yourself and maybe even God. If that is how you feel, let the example of Moses encourage you. That God has not forgotten you, that he hears you, that he sees you, and he knows your sorrows. Let the Holy Spirit minister you this morning to remind you of who God is, that the God who lifted Moses out of desolation, the God who delivered his people, is the same God today who will deliver you. And I just want to end with this really short poem as we reflect on today's word. It says, praying, resting, waiting, trusting. These are words that tell a story. As we wait for God to lead us, he responds, just seek my glory. Thank you for listening.